I'd like you to turn to Joshua chapter 1 with me this morning. I want to go through a section of Scripture here and use this as the basis for my message today to understand a little bit more about the life we live today and the battle that we face on a regular basis. So we're going to use Joshua as an example of how to battle in this life. So I'd like to read through just this section here first in Joshua chapter 1. And let's read down to verse 9. So Joshua chapter 1 and verse 1, after the death of Moses, the servant of the Lord said to Joshua the son of Nun, Moses' assistant, Moses, my servant, is dead, and now therefore arise and go over this Jordan, you and all this people, into the land that I'm giving to them, to the people of Israel. Every place that the sole of your foot will tread upon, I've given to you, just as I promised to Moses. From the wilderness and this Lebanon, as far as the great river, the river Euphrates, all the land of the Hittites to the great sea, toward the going down of the sun shall be your territory. No man shall be able to stand before you all the days of your life, just as I was with Moses, so I will be with you. I will not leave you nor forsake you. Be strong and courageous, for you shall cause this people to inherit the land that I swore to their fathers to give them, and only be strong and very courageous, being careful to do according to all the law that Moses my servant commanded you. Don't turn from it to the right hand, to the left, that you may have good success wherever you go. This book of the law shall not depart from your mouth, but you shall meditate on it day and night, so that you may be careful to do according to all that's written in it. For then you will make your way prosperous, and then you will have good success. Have I not commanded you? Be strong and courageous. Do not be frightened and do not be dismayed, for the Lord your God is with you wherever you go. You know, in all history, certainly the Bible, but maybe even all history, there has never been a greater commander than Joshua. Military commanders have studied Joshua's battles to learn how to battle themselves. Joshua was responsible for taking the land of Canaan as an inheritance for the Israelites. And it was a land that God said would be a holy land for his holy people. And Joshua took that responsibility, that task, and he held it in high regard. And it was no doubt a daunting task that was set before him to go in and to take all of this land into this new land that had giants in them, right? And in this land that had many city-states where Canaanites and all the other ites lived, many of them. And they controlled the mountain countries, they controlled the valley countries. But God told Joshua 3 times to be strong and have courage, and God would be with him. That even though there were people in the land, and many of them to battle, God was going to be with him and them through that journey. Joshua's story stands for us in the Old Testament not as simply a historical account of the conquest of the land of Canaan, but as a spiritual example for our conversion today. So I'd like to look briefly at the story of Joshua, some of the things that he faced and the children of Israel faced as they entered the land. And we're going to come to the first city, the defeating of Jericho. And you'll remember that. Joshua sent out 2 spies into the city of Jericho to spy out the land, and they ended up in the house of Rahab the harlot, who told them that the whole land feared the children of Israel because of what God had done for them at the Red Sea. That story had spread abroad, and how they defeated the Amorites across the river Jordan. And so when the news of this returned to Joshua, he set about to cross the Jordan and to prepare for the battle that was at hand. Chapter 6, I'd like you to look at Joshua chapter 6. We're going to see here this taking of Jericho. Joshua chapter 6, and look at verse 9. Joshua 6, verse 9 says, armed troops marched ahead of the priests, blowing the horns. And they're following the instructions that were given before. While the rear guard followed along behind the ark, blowing ram's horns. Now Joshua had instructed the army, don't give a battle cry or raise your voices and say nothing until the day I tell you. Give the battle cry, and then give the battle cry when I say that. So Joshua made sure they marched the ark of the Lord around the city one time, and then they came back to the camp and spent the night. So they did that every day. It says, verse 12, bright and early the next morning, Joshua had the priests pick up the ark of the Lord. The 7 priests carrying the 7 ram's horns before the ark of the Lord marched along, blowing their horns. Armed troops marched ahead of them, while the rear guard followed along behind the ark of the Lord, blowing ram's horns. And they marched around the city one time on the second day and returned to the camp. And they did this for 6 days in all. Verse 15, on the 7th day, they were up at the crack of dawn. I'm reading from the Net version. And marched around the city as before, only this time they marched around it 7 times. And the 7th time around, the priests blew the ram's horns. And Joshua told the army, give the battle cry, for the Lord is handing the city over to you. And the city and all that is in it must be set apart for the Lord, except for Rahab the prostitute and all who are with her in her house, because she hid the spies we sent. But be careful when you're setting apart the riches for the Lord. If you take any of it, you will make the camp of Israel subject to annihilation and cause a disaster. All the gold and silver, as well as the bronze and iron items, belong to the Lord. They must go into the Lord's treasury. And the ram's horn sounded, and when the army heard the signal, they gave a loud battle cry, and the walls collapsed. And the warriors charged straight up into the city and captured it. And they annihilated with the sword everything that breathed in the city, including men and women, young and old, as well as cattle, sheep, and donkeys. So there was this city, Jericho, and you can go there today and you can see the walls collapsed inward, forming a ramp where the children of Israel could go right up into that city and take it without hardly any resistance. And they were told to kill everything except to leave what was the riches for the treasury. That was what they had to overcome when they entered to the promised land. So, brethren, let me ask you the question. What is your Jericho? What is your Jericho? You know, everyone that comes to God has a Jericho that they have to battle and defeat. Every one of us has a city that looms so large over us as we begin to walk with God. And it could be the initial difficulty that you faced while you were being called. It might be a challenge that was standing in your way immediately after baptism. Or it might be the single biggest trial of your life. Maybe you haven't faced your Jericho yet. I don't know. What is your Jericho? I think for me, and I'm going to look at it from my perspective, is it's more of what I think of as an initial roadblock in your walk with life. What was that initial thing that you had to overcome? And for me, you know, I'm going to tell you a little story about when I was young. When I was 7 years old, my parents had divorced. And so I had to go and split my time between my mom and my dad. My mom lived in Kansas City, my dad lived in Colorado. And so every summer I would go out there, and I did that for 7 or 8 summers, something of that nature. And I was 7 years old when I spent my first summer in Colorado without my mom, with my dad there. And it was 1975, and I remember being out in the field, sitting on horses. My dad was on a horse, I was on a horse. We loved riding horses, and we were just running around the field. And I remember, it was Saturday. I remember thinking to myself, what are we doing out here on Saturday? It's very bizarre to me. And so it was strange, you know. So I asked my dad, you know, who had stopped going to church, and for years I think I had asked him, why weren't we going to church today? But the more I have thought about that response that he gave me, I thought, well, maybe I didn't say that. Maybe I said, why don't you go to church on Saturday? Maybe that was it, because the response was a barking back at me. It was a you know, my dad didn't yell, but boy, he yelled on this one. He's like, don't ever ask me that question again. And so I didn't. Never came up again. Never asked him again why, you know, we didn't or he didn't go to church on Saturday. So for the next 6 years, you know, every summer I rode horses. And we rode in gymkhanas and we raced horses, and I was on a horse every day, it seems like, in the summertime. And I had a great time. Loved it. Loved it so much. It was time consuming, and that's why I don't ride horses anymore, because it's so time consuming. But I really liked doing it with my dad. Well, it was one year, I think it was the summer of 1981, I was going to go out that year, and my mom had been talking to me, as she slowly had been, about accountability and responsibility to God's law. And doing the right thing, and she knew that I didn't go to church on Saturday. And now she didn't push me, she didn't yell at me, and she knew that I was under my dad's roof and there was nothing she could do about it. But she always gave a little encouragement along the way. And I think, I've thought back and I thought, well, if she pushed too hard on that particular issue, maybe I would have backfired on her, But she never pushed that hard. And so I remember her saying, well, you know the right thing to do, and the decision's up to you. And so we were talking in the kitchen as I was, preparing to leave, and she said, I'm going to give you the number of a lady that we used to go to church with in Iowa. And so her name was Pam. She gave me her number. She said, if you want to, you can call her. And I've already talked to her. She'll come pick you up, take you to church. She'll bring you back home. And I think Boulder and Denver are about 30 minutes apart, something like that. So she'd actually come from Denver, pick me up in Boulder, and take me to church, and then bring me back. And so here I was at the age of 13, and I'm agonizing over this Jericho. It's standing in front of me. And, right down the street from this house, they raced horses. We had gymkhanas there. And I loved doing that. And I knew my dad loved doing it with me. And this was actually before the whole, the summer was getting started. And I thought to myself, if I don't say something soon, it's going to be too late. And so I remember sitting, at the breakfast table. And I've got this stronghold in my mind that's been built. What is my dad going to think, if I tell him I want to go to church? I didn't want to disappoint him. And then in my, this inner stronghold exists too, of what if I said something to my dad and he yells at me? I don't want that to happen either, because I didn't want this to devolve in an argument. I didn't know what was going to happen. So one morning, I'm sitting across the breakfast table, and he's got his paper up in his face, reading it. And I thought, what a better time to mention something to him so I don't have to look at his face. Right? Do your kids talk to you from behind? Mine do. They won't look at my face. So with my heart beating fast, I said, Dad, is it okay if I go to church on Saturday? Pam said that she could pick me up and bring me back. Okay, if that's what you want to do. And that was it. And so I did. So she came and she picked me up. And in a sense, for me, Jericho was conquered. So I kind of got over that hump of wanting to do the right thing and doing the right thing. So it actually got to the point where my dad would sometimes take me to church, and sometimes he'd go to Denver and he'd pick me up. So it got better. I learned here recently that we were talking to Tim McMaster. He's an elder in Denver. And he said that he remembered me coming to church when I was 13. He said it was very odd to see a teenager that young coming to church on their own. I was like, wow, I can't even believe you remember something like that. They had a church of like 400 people at the time. But it was really interesting to talk to him about that about a year or two ago. I'd like you to turn to 2 Corinthians chapter 10 with me. Because though Joshua and the Israelites fought the inhabitants of the land, they fought against flesh and blood. We don't do that today. We fight something that is even more powerful, something that is even more challenging than Jericho. 2 Corinthians chapter 10 and verse 3, it says, "For though we walk in the flesh, we do not walk according to the flesh. For the weapons of our warfare are not carnal, but mighty through God to the pulling down of strongholds." So what strongholds, brethren, have been built up that exist in your mind today? Certain things that may have happened in your life, and you built up strongholds. You built up a fortress. And these fortresses need to be thrown down. What is it that needs to be torn down? Is there a stronghold that continues to get stronger because you build the walls thicker or you build the walls higher, right? These are ways that you would make it harder to overcome things. Verse 5, casting down arguments and every high thing that exalts itself against the knowledge of God. Well, what exalts itself against the knowledge of God? Well, this could be hundreds of things. You can think of all sorts of things. You go home, you may contemplate this today. What sort of strongholds have you built up that exalts itself against the knowledge of God? One thing that comes to my mind is negativity. When God said to Joshua, go in and take the land, oh, and while you do it, be strong and good courage because you know I'll never leave you. Joshua didn't say, have you seen how tall those walls are? There's no way we can scale them. Even if I threw a rope up there, there's no way. How do you think I'm going to get up there? That's impossible. And don't tell me to ram through the walls. Do you see how thick they are? It's not going to happen. That's negativity exalting itself against the knowledge of God. God says it's going to happen. I'm going to make it happen. You need to believe me it's going to happen. And negativity will often manifest itself in unbelief. Well, I don't believe you. Here's what we tend to think. Lord, I know that you say that you'll always be with me. And I know you tell me to have courage no matter what happens. To have courage in the situation. It'll all be okay. But God, I don't believe you. I don't believe you. And we can tend to build these things up in our minds. And it pulls us down. These are the things that have to be cast down and brought into captivity. Defeat Jericho. Look in verse 5 how it continues, in bringing into captivity every thought to the obedience of Christ. So what is your Jericho? What is your Jericho? After they defeated Jericho, Joshua and the Israelites moved on. And Joshua set his sights on the city of Ai now, the next city. And after the spies had gone to the city, they said, well, it's going to be easy. Let's read about this in Joshua chapter 7. Joshua chapter 7 and verse 2. Joshua sent men from Jericho to Ai and instructed them, go up and spy on the land. So the men went up and spied on Ai. And they returned and reported to Joshua, don't send the whole army. About 2,000 or 3,000 men are adequate to defeat Ai. And don't tire out the whole army, for Ai is small. So about 3,000 men went up and they fled from the men of Ai. And the men of Ai killed about 36 of them and chased them, that's the Israelites, from in front of the city gate all the way back to the fissures and defeated them on the steep slope. And the people's courage melted away like water. And Joshua tore his clothes and the leaders of Israel lay face down on the ground before the ark of the Lord until evening and threw dirt on their heads. And Joshua prayed, O Master, Lord, why did you bring these people across the Jordan to hand us over to the Amorites so that they could destroy us? If only we had been satisfied to live on the other side of the Jordan. O Lord, what can I say now that Israel has retreated before its enemies? And so he thinks, let's go back. Let's go back. Let's go back to what we knew. Let's not do this new thing here. And Joshua was greatly grieved. Why was God doing this to him and to them? I think Ai is typical for a lot of us in our Christian battle. We have great success, something that we've defeated, this battle that we've overcome, this great city of Jericho. Yay, we're feeling really good about ourselves. And the next thing you know, we have this monumental letdown. And sometimes we like to enjoy a little bit of the success that Jericho brought us. So Jericho brought us success, so why can't I take a coin or two from the spoils of that battle? I'll take a coin or two and I'll enjoy it. I worked hard for it. And then the next battle comes along and bam, it blindsides you and you're like, where did that come from? Because you were too busy looking at the shiny coin in the first place, you weren't ready for the next battle. The coin goes into the Lord's treasury, and that is stored up in heaven for you. Don't worry about the coin. God's going to give you plenty of goodness along the way. He'll give you just what you need and maybe even a little bit more. You just need to be prepared for the next battle, because whether you know it or not, it's already sized you up. The enemy is already ready for you. It's ready for you. You may not be ready for it. Stay on guard. This is what happened at Ai. I want to show you something that we didn't read in 2 Corinthians chapter 10. I forgot to tell you to hold your spot there. 2 Corinthians chapter 10, and look at what verse 6 says. 2 Corinthians 10 and verse 6. It says, and having a readiness to punish all disobedience when your obedience is fulfilled. Okay, so once your obedience has been fulfilled, and once you've done everything that you've been told to do, and Jericho is now fallen, now you need to be on guard. You need to be aware. You need to be ready to put down all disobedience. Because the enemy is out there, and he's always looking for the right opportunity. And it tends to happen when you are distracted looking at that bright, shiny coin. As Jesus said in Luke chapter 12, when you've brought all the grain into the storehouses, don't say, well, soul, you have ample good laid up for many years. Relax, eat, drink, and be merry. That's resting on your laurels, thinking it's going to carry you through. And you can think over the years of the success stories that people have had being converted or being called out of the world. I think back to different splits that we've gone through. And people have broken away from the trappings of the world. And at some point, they may have thought to themselves, well, I've stored up a lot of goods. I've overcome a lot of problems. I've dealt with a lot of things. And they lose sight because they look at the trophies, on all the awards they had coming along the way. And they weren't ready to defeat the cities that were coming up. And they lost the battle. And with Joshua, once the sin of Achan was discovered and destroyed, only then were they able to attack and defeat the city of Ai. You see, when we trust God in every aspect of our lives, when we trust that He'll take care of us in the good times and in the bad times, and we submit ourselves to the power of Christ dwelling in us through the Holy Spirit, we can expect nothing but victory. That's the ultimate outcome. Joshua went on to conquer many more cities in Canaan. He took Lachish in 2 days, and we know that Lachish went on to become one of the strongest fortresses of Judah. It's a great victory. Perhaps there is a stronghold out there, brethren, that you have not reached yet. And because of your past victories, your Lachish is going to fall in 2 days, just like Lachish. Right? It's going to fall quickly. You're going to overcome it because of what you've done in the past. It's going to help you on to the next battle. And God has set you up and prepared you for the next victory. And that weakness that you perceived, right? Because we always think of weakness. If we didn't do it, right? It's weakness. But that weakness that we've perceived will be turned into strength. I want to tell you a quick story about an individual who I think exemplifies this very well. His name is Nick Vujicic. And maybe you've heard him. Maybe you've seen this man named Nick Vujicic. It's kind of strange. He's from Australia. And he was born in 1982 in Melbourne. And unbeknownst to his parents and his doctors, Nick was born into this world without arms and without legs. He had sort of a foot flapper thing going on. And throughout his childhood, Nick dealt not only with the typical challenges of school and adolescence, but bullying, and esteem issues. He struggled with depression, as you can imagine. He struggled with loneliness. And he questioned why he was different than other kids. And he couldn't get the haunting question out of his mind, why was I born without arms and legs? It was constantly in his head growing up. At one point, Nick attempted suicide. I think he was 8 years old, roughly. And I think he said he saw a picture of his parents and family members over his head weeping, and he said, I would never want to put them through that, so he didn't do that again. But as Nick grew, he learned to deal with his disability, and he gradually accomplished more than he ever thought he could have on his own. It was a janitor at his high school who had inspired him to start speaking publicly about overcoming adversity. And so Nick began at the age of 17 to speak to high school students. And this was the springboard into a worldwide platform. Eventually, he got his degree, got a double bachelor's degree, but he used his speeches and his disability to encourage other people around him. And his speeches revolve around his life story. I think Nick has spoken to somewhere around 400 million people worldwide now. It's a remarkable story. This was Nick's Lakish, the way I see it. He turned victory into a fortress. He turned it into a stronghold for the good. And as I said, he's spoken to millions of people over the world. He has a motivational speaking. He has his own, Protestant ministry that he does as well. But brethren, our life is a battle. That's what you need to know. Life is a battle. We focus so much on the aspect of peacemaking and compassion and concern and caring and loving and hope and those character traits that place us in that particular mold of Jesus Christ, that it's easy to forget that we truly are Christian soldiers. You are a soldier. And many of the words in the New Testament are military terms. You are a Christian soldier. 2 Timothy chapter 2. I want to show you this. 2 Timothy chapter 2, as Paul writes to Timothy here in verse 3, he says, share in suffering as a good soldier of Jesus Christ. Share in suffering as a good soldier of Jesus Christ. Now, suffering comes in many forms. We can suffer wrongly for things that are out of our control. Maybe you can think of something like that. I think we've all gone through something where something is completely out of our control and we've suffered for it. There are things that I can think of in my own life. But I want to give you an example of something, suffering that someone went through that I went to college with. There was this girl that I went to college with. She was let's call her Jennifer. Jennifer was a beautiful girl. I had somewhat of a crush on Jennifer. I never dated her. I was a senior, I believe, if I'm not mistaken. She was a freshman or sophomore. I can't remember exactly. It's kind of odd, It's a strange dynamic on college campuses because when the next class comes in, the freshman class comes in, it's a ritual for the boys to scope out all the freshman girls. That's the way it works, right? You got to check all of the fresh prospects every year, and if you're not studying for a test, you're probably talking about girls. There's that song, "Girls Chase Boys, Chase Girls." Right? This is what adolescents do, and the girls are always talking about the boys. So this is the dynamic, of course. And the sad thing really is that when the next class comes in, the sophomore girls are like, they're just pushed to the side. Nobody cares about the sophomore girls anymore. It's always the freshmen. And it felt bad for the sophomore girls. So that you had to date them just because you felt bad for them because, they were the discarded, I'm just kidding here, discarded bunch. Anyway, of course, all the attention was lavished on the freshmen. So anyway, okay, back to Jennifer. That's where we were at before. Okay, so Jennifer, as pretty as she was, she seemed to have the pick of the lot. She seemed to, could pick any guys that she wanted. And like I said, I never dated her, and I think she ended up pairing up pretty quickly with somebody. But I remember seeing Jennifer. I remember so vividly going to the bookstore and seeing her, and it was like the last day of school, if I remember right, and I was graduating, was getting ready to leave. And things were winding down. I remember talking to her briefly, and I remember thinking to myself, man, this girl's got it together. She seems very with it. She seems to love the Lord. And I can see a bright future ahead of her. She was smart. She was witty. She was level-headed. She seemed to have all the right things in place. And there are times, brethren, when you will talk to somebody, you'll see somebody, and you'll think, man, they're going to have a good life. They seem to have everything put together really well. Now, I didn't see Jennifer, I think, for 16 years. I actually saw her 16 years later. And when I did, she was happily married. And I think she had 2 children at the time. And one of them was running around and playing. And the other one was sitting in a high-back chair, wheelchair. And I remember learning that her daughter had spina bifida and a mental disability. And I remember my heart sinking for her for many reasons. Knowing that the hard work that she was going to be in the middle of, she probably was day in and day out, and of course the effort and the sacrifice it took to take care of her daughter. But I also thought of the shattered expectations that she had for her life. You know, let's face it, when we marry and start a family, you don't start thinking with the expectation that you're going to have someone who's going to be in a wheelchair. That's not your expectation, right? Nevertheless, even on top of that, having a mental disability, right, to deal with all those things that go along with it. You don't dream of, for instance, wiping drool from your child's mouth for more than a year or two. You think, well, that's going to be it, and then it'll move on. Well, this wasn't the case with her. It was on and on. You know, you don't hope to change diapers for 30, 40, 50 years. You think a couple of years and that'll be it. Girls don't write in their diaries that they hope one day their child will be able to spell their name. That's not the hope. You see, these are not our expectations, and when almost anything diverges from our expectations, there's some sort of a trauma and there's some sort of a suffering that happens to us, to our minds, to our psyche. You know, one reason for disagreements in marriages and friendships is when the reality doesn't match our firm expectations. You have an expectation of way that you picture things you believe ought to be or should be, and when you overlay the reality on top of that, if it doesn't match up, whoa, this isn't right. This isn't the way it should be. We have a problem, and we have suffering. Now, let me tell you something I think that's really important. Sharing in the suffering of Jesus Christ as a good soldier has little to do with situations like the one I'm telling you about. And I'll tell you this for this reason. I'm not saying that what Jennifer is going through and what you are going through or what I am going through is not suffering, right? It is. It is. But suffering, for the sake of suffering, is not fulfilling the role of a Christian soldier. I'm just going to suffer through it. Fulfilling the role is how we handle the suffering. It's how do you deal with the suffering? And this is the critical matter of importance, I think, that we need to understand with distinction that everyone suffers, brethren. Everyone suffers. There's not a person on this planet that doesn't suffer. You're not the only one. I'm not the only one, right? If I go down the road here and I punch somebody in the face and they pull out a gun and they shoot me, did they suffer? Yeah. Did they suffer rightly as a Christian soldier? No, they didn't. So how do they handle the suffering? How do you handle the suffering? This is the city that has to be overcome. How do you handle the suffering? This is the battleground in the mind. The battleground's between the ears. It's in the brain. It's not on the battlefield like Joshua dealt with. It's in the mind. How do you battle with these things that we go through today? How do you deal with the unwarranted circumstances in our lives on a day in and day out basis? What is your response in it? These are the cities that have to be conquered. And when we look at all the cities that were taken by Joshua, those cities are really like spiritual battlefields. How do we handle it? How do we deal with it? How do we feel in it? How do we respond to them? How do we behave in them? How do we react or act to them? I want to show you some scriptures. I'd like you to look at 2 Timothy chapter 2, and we're going to move down to verse 14 now. So Paul was just talking about suffering as a good soldier. Now in verse 14 of 2 Timothy 2, he says this, "Remind them of these things and charge them before God not to quarrel about words, which does no good but only ruins the hearers." Verse 16, "But avoid irreverent babble, for it will lead people into more and more ungodliness, and their talk will spread like gangrene." Verse 23, "Have nothing to do with foolishness, ignorant controversies. You know that they breed quarrels. And the Lord's servant must not be quarrelsome, but kind to everyone, able to teach, patiently enduring evil." Now look over at the next chapter, chapter 3 and verse 1. "But understand this, that in the last days there will come times of difficulty, for people will be lovers of themselves, lovers of money, proud, arrogant, abusive, disobedient to their parents, ungrateful, unholy, heartless, unappeasable, slanderous, without self-control, brutal, not loving good, treacherous, reckless, swollen with conceit, lovers of pleasure rather than lovers of God, having the appearance of godliness but denying its power. Avoid such people." Avoid these people. Look at all the characteristics that people will manifest because of the battleground of the mind. That's the battle in the brain. Now, the things that are listed here are about traits that we will see in the last days. And we see the manifestations of them in the actions. Right? The thoughts begin up here, and it manifests through actions because you work it out, right? And people's behavior. But again, the mind is where the battle is waged. Now, for instance, pride and arrogance. We could take those two, right? These are cities in the plains and cities in the mountains that we need to conquer in our minds as we battle towards the kingdom. Look over at Galatians chapter 5. I want to read Galatians chapter 5. I'll read from the Net version again. Galatians chapter 5, and let's read, and we'll see some of these same qualities again. Chapter 5, verses 16. Verse 16, we'll start in verse 16. "But I say, live by the Spirit, and you will not carry out the desires of the flesh, for the flesh has desires that are opposed to the Spirit, and the Spirit has desires that are opposed to the flesh. For they are in opposition to each other, so that you cannot do what you want. But if you are led by the Spirit, you are not under the law." That means under the penalty of the law. "Now the works of the flesh are obvious." Well, it says they're obvious. "Sexual immorality, impurity, depravity, idolatry, sorcery, hostilities, strife, jealousy, outbursts of anger, selfish rivalries, dissensions, factions, envying, murder, drunkenness, carousing, and similar things. I am warning you, as I had warned you before, those who practice such things will not inherit the kingdom of God." Now, I want you to notice that right here in the middle of these things that we would consider despicable actions, like, for instance, we've got sexual immorality, right? So committing adultery, sexual fornication, things like that, impurity, depravity, idolatry, sorcery. These are things that are just, I don't have murder in here. I think it does have murder in verse 21. So all of these things, right? We consider these despicable actions. Right in the middle of them, what do you see? You see hostilities. You see envy, strife, jealousy, outbursts of anger, rivalries, dissensions, factions. Not things that we would necessarily think to put on the same level or category as some of the other things. These are more subtle and are subjects that are sort of intertwined with others. But in other words, it's difficult to have any of these if there isn't someone else around, right? How do you deal with these when there's nobody around to have envy over, right? Or to be jealous over, or to have rivalries or factions? You got to have people around to do that, right? Now, I guess you could manifest towards God. I mean, Satan did, right? These sort of what am I trying to say? Mental issues. But if you're on an island, are you going to have rivalries? Are you going to have factions? Right? Are you going to have dissensions? I suppose it is possible. You've heard of Me, Myself, and Irene. You could battle it out. You may have heard the story of a man who was stranded on a desert island. Do you hear the story about a man who was stranded on a deserted island? I guess he was shipwrecked, and he was there for several years. And eventually a ship came to save him. And so they got off, walked on the island, and they said, "Are you the only person on the island?" He goes, "Yeah, I'm the only one." It was, "So why are there two churches here?" And he said, "Well, this is the church I go to over here, and this is the church I used to go to, but I left." It's kind of the story of people, right? Verse 22. But the fruit of the Spirit is love, joy, peace, patience, kindness, goodness, faithfulness, gentleness, and self-control. Against such there is no law. Now, why is the law made for the sinner and not the righteous? Right? Why is that the case? Well, here it is. Because the sinner needs to be told where they're going wrong. Righteous doesn't. Verse 24, now those who belong to Christ have crucified the flesh with its passions and desires. And brethren, this is the battle that we wage at Jericho, at Ai, at Lachish, at Hebron. All of these cities, this is what we battle today. For in verse 29, if we live by the Spirit, let us also behave in accordance with the Spirit. Let us not become conceited, provoking one another, being jealous of one another. Now, I could contrast the two previous stories I told you, right? Nick Vujicic and Jennifer. And in the case of Jennifer, she suffered. But what I didn't tell you is that she could never come to terms with her situation. She couldn't have faith that God was with her, that she should be strong and courageous, and she ultimately decided that there must not be a God. Because how could God allow something like this to happen to her child and not heal her? How is that possible? And then there's Nick Vujicic, born without arms or legs, and he considered suicide at one point, but yet he responded to his condition in nothing less than what we would consider godly, and took his message to the world and has helped many people along the way. And that's the city we have to face. And finally, there's one other aspect I'd like to look at before we close. It's in Judges chapter 1. And it's after Joshua had become old and died. And we learn that Joshua did not take the entire land of Canaan. And this was left to the tribes to do their job. But we learned that they never could do it completely. Joshua chapter 1, look at verse 27. But Manasseh did not drive out the people of Beit Shan, or Tanakh, or Dor, or Ibleam, or Megiddo, and their surrounding settlements, for the Canaanites were determined to live in that land. You may try to battle a city, it's going to battle you back. When Israel became strong, they pressed the Canaanites into the forced labor, but they never drove them out completely. Nor did Ephraim drive out the Canaanites from Gezer, but the Canaanites continued to live there among them. And neither did Zebulun drive out the Canaanites living in Kitron or in Ahol. So those Canaanites lived among them, but Zebulun did subject them to forced labor. Nor did Asher drive out those living in Echo, Sidon, or I'm not sure how to pronounce these, Ehlab, Akzib, Helbah, Aphnik, or Rahab. And the Asherites lived among the Canaanite inhabitants of the land because they did not drive them out. Verse 33, neither did Naphtali drive out those living in Beth Shemesh or Beth Anath. But the Naphtalites too lived among the Canaanites, inhabitants of the land. And those living in Beth Shemesh and Beth Anath became forced laborers for them. The Amorites confined the Danites to the hill country, not allowing them to come down into the plain. And the Amorites were determined to hold out in Mount Heres, Ajalon, and Shablim. But when the power of the tribes of Joseph increased, they too were pressed into forced labor. The boundary of the Amorites were from Scorpion Pass to Selah and beyond. I remember hearing a quote. It said something like this: people are so concerned about not wanting to suffer that they're not so concerned about sin. And I think sometimes that's the case. You're so worried about suffering that you forget about sin. And it's the sin that brought you to the suffering sometimes. Now, sometimes it's unjustified. But a lot of times it's the sin that brings you there. And we're so concerned about not doing that, we don't get to the root of the problem. But those are the battles we face. In this life, brethren, this is what happens to us. This is the battle we go through. As much as we battle, as much as we fight, as much as we press towards the kingdom, we will continue to have cities to cast down while in the flesh. We can't conquer them all in the flesh. We will not conquer them all in the flesh. They're always going to be there. But we can do the best we can do to conquer everything in front of us in the time that we have. So, as we get older, and as we all are getting older, right? Don't ask yourself, man, what do I have left to do? There's plenty to do. Start redeeming the time. There is plenty of battles to face, and you need to be on guard for them. Today, tomorrow, and next year, you will have a battle, and you need to be prepared for it. So take the tools that you have. Make sure you're in the Bible. Spend time with God's Word. Get that Word and infuse it within you. Spend time in prayer, fasting to draw closer to God, to get that power. And as we're going to look at next weekend, Pentecost, and utilize the Spirit that's been given to you. And if it's in you, utilize it. It's the power that's there. And if it's with you and not yet in you, utilize it. It's still there for you. And eventually it will be in you. Brethren, we are Christian soldiers, and we are marching to war. We have many battles to fight in the years ahead, so keep fighting, because the promised land is waiting for you.